Imagine if I was to tell you that 14 centuries ago, a man in the Arabian deserts prophesied the destruction of one of the world's greatest empires, and that every utterance of his prophecy became reality just as he had foretold it. It is not the story of some historical drama film, and it is not some lost legend heard among some old manuscripts. It is a historical truth, a living miracle, and one of the several evidence of the authenticity of the last messenger, Prophet Muhammad. As the world presently argues over prophecies, predictions, and supposed clairvoyance, the utterances of Rasulullah remain unparalleled. Utterances which not only foretold the invisible, but revealed whole ages of the future with heavenly clarity. His tongue spoke not from guesswork or fantasy, but from wahi revelation. And of the numerous nations and powers that he spoke of, one is most outstanding in its beauty and its downfall: Persia, or Iran, as it is called today. This was the seat of an empire so great, so mighty, and so proud that no one could even have imagined that it would fall. But fall it did, just as prophesied. And now, as you listen to this tale, you will not only be hearing history, you will be seeing a miracle unfold, word for word, event by event. The world of 1,400 years ago was different from ours. It was an era when kings ruled with iron wills and divine pride. The Roman Empire dominated the West, the Abyssinians in Africa and the East. Standing there was the unrivaled majesty of the Persian Empire. Persia was not merely a nation, it was an icon of heritage. Its palaces shone with gold-layered facades. Its libraries contained the knowledge of centuries. Its kings, particularly Khusro Parvis, were revered by their citizens like divinities. His throne, the Takisra, loomed over the capital Madine like a crown on the earth. His courts were adorned with jewels. His armies were hundreds of thousands strong, and his power extended from the banks of the Tigris to the borders of Central Asia. People shook at his behest. Rulers genuflected before him. He was the King of Kings, and he believed that nothing, no one could ever challenge his authority. But, away from the great halls of Madame, in the modest city of Medina, a man who had never learned to read off a scroll, had never sat in a court of kings, and had never learned from human hands, was learning from the Lord of the worlds. The man was Muhammad. When the prophet started propagating the word of Islam, he didn't limit it to Arabia. He wrote to the world rulers not only to warn them, but also to invite them with honor, with peace, and with truth. One such writing was to Khusro Parvis, the Shahena of Persia. The message was brief in words, but strong in meaning. Come to Islam and you will be saved. Allah will reward you double. But it had started with a sentence that touched the king's ego. From Muhammad, the prophet of God, to Khusro, the king of kings of Persia. For a man who considered himself as God amongst man, this was something worse than blasphemy. How could this Arab, this man without an empire, place his name ahead of mine? In his rage, Khusro ripped the letter to shreds. This act of hubris would be remembered in eternity. When word of what Khusro had done reached Prophet Ta, he threatened nothing. He ordered no army. He merely said with complete faith, "May Allah dismantle his kingdom the way he dismantled my letter." That sentence, those words were not a reply. They were a prophecy which would not take centuries to occur. It would start unfolding within months. Khusro, the strongest man in the East, had signed his own throne's death warrant unknowingly, not by an adversary, but by the surety of a prophet whose each utterance was from the heavens. And it was only the beginning of the tale. The day that the letter of Prophet Muhammad arrived at the court of Khusro Parvis, the grand halls of Persia rang with drums of ceremony, shone with gold, and served as a proud beacon of an empire that ruled for centuries. Courtiers, generals, and viziers occupied the throne room as the royal scribe read the parchment aloud. It was no trivial message. It was a call from the last messenger of Allah, a call to leave deceit and embrace the everlasting truth of Islam. But for Khusro Parvez, a man who had been deified by his people, who thought himself to be God's shadow on earth, the words inscribed on that letter hit at the very center of his ego. How could the man from the desolate deserts of Arabia, a people whom the Persians had long treated with contempt, speak to him directly? How could he presume to put his name before that of the Shahana, the King of Kings? It was an indignity to Khusro. In an act of blinding arrogance, he stood up from his throne and ripped the letter to pieces with his own hands, uttering in contempt that the man who wrote this must be mad or out of his mind. His anger was not political, it was personal. He was insulted, he was dishonored, he was challenged. But he did not realize that what he had just destroyed was not ink on paper. It was a call from heaven, and in ripping it up, he had not offended a man, but had provoked the Lord of the worlds. This indignity did not travel far before reaching Medina. When news of it arrived there, the Prophet bin received it with the serenity of heavenly assurance and replied not with vengeance but with revelation. He uttered, "As he ripped my epistle, Allah let him tear his empire asunder. No emissaries dispatched, no war announced, only a remark, gentle of tone, yet devastating in effect. And as matters would prove in the course of history, the words would precipitate a series of events that no troops could stand in the way of, no ramparts hold back, nor empire outrun. For when a prophet speaks according to Allah's will, the universe itself acts to make it come true." Khusra, his wrath yet burning, did not content himself with ripping the letter. He instructed the governor of Yemen, Badhan, then in Persian control, to send men to arrest the prophet and bring him before the Persian court in chains. Imagine the pride and arrogance to think he could call in the messenger of Allah like a recalcitrant subject. Badhan, acting on instructions, sent 2 of his loyal officers to go through the deserts and arrive at Medina. They arrived and did not find a palace, nor guards, nor golden thrones, but a simple, serene man whose very presence emanated a strength they could not understand. They asked to see the prophet of ours, and he instructed them to come back the following day. They did not know that when they came back, their whole conception of reality would be altered forever. That evening, in the still moments before morning, the prophet was told by revelation of something out of the ordinary, something that had just happened a few hundred miles away within the center of the Persian palace. When the 2 officers returned, the following day, the prophet gazed at them and declared, "Go to your master and inform him that his King-Ro was murdered last night by his own son." The officers were amazed. This couldn't happen. How could a man in far-off Medina possibly know what had happened in the inner sanctums of the Persian palace? There was no means the news could travel so fast, yet the prophet spoke in complete conviction as if he had witnessed it himself. Perplexed, the officers went back to Yemen and delivered the message to Baden. Weeks went by, and then a royal letter arrived in Persia. The seal was opened, and the words authenticated what the prophet had predicted. Khusro had actually been murdered by his own son, Shoya. The unimaginable had occurred. The King of Kings had been killed, not in war, not by the foreign sword, but by his own family. And the man who had prophesied it was no mere man. Upon hearing this, Badan, governor of Yemen, was overcome with wonder. He collected his people and proclaimed with certainty, "This cannot be the knowledge of a mere mortal. Muhammad is indeed a messenger of Allah." Not only did Badhan convert to Islam, but the entire Yemen region, previously a Persian province, now joined the fold of Islam voluntarily. No war, no invasion, but truth that had made itself known through prophecy. But the death of Khusra was not merely the assassination of an individual, it was the end of the disintegration of an empire. Following his assassination, anarchy engulfed Persia. Successive rulers succeeded one another like shooting stars, each one of them weaker, more unstable, and more corrupt than the previous one. Civil disturbances escalated. Assassinations became the order of the day. The once great Sassanid dynasty, which had occupied power for centuries, started to decay from the core. While the Prophet kept summoning people to Islam, the great empire, which had split his message, was splitting itself. Its armies demoralized, its throne insecure, its people confused. Persia was crumbling, not through swords or sieges, but under the burden of a divine mandate. And so, with merely a letter and a prayer, the prophecy of the prophet started unfolding. What seemed to be a simple diplomatic affront proved to be the turning point in the history of nations. Khusro's hubris brought his empire down. The prophet's verity raised his message, and the world would never again be the same. Following the defeat of Khusro Parvez, the empire which he previously ruled started to shake like a tower erected on sand. Successors ascended the throne one after another, but none were stable enough to wear the crown. Some occupied the throne for months, while others did so for days. Conspiracies were hatched, daggers were unsheathed, and palace corridors that were once filled with royal proclamations were now filled with conspiracies and treason. The mighty Persian Empire, which for many centuries had mesmerized the world with its military power, its architectural grandeur, and its learned prowess, was now hemorrhaging from within. The Persian's throne had become a haunted seat, where every new ruler knew he may not live long enough to sleep upon it twice. The divine warning was no longer an empty threat. It had come into being. What the Prophet Muhammad had foretold after Khusro rent the letter was happening step by step. The lion had roared, and now the empire was breaking down under its own weight. At the same time, in Arabia, a new power was secretly coalescing. But this was no power of earthly greed. This was no empire forming for riches, no people famished for conquest. This was a movement born of faith, born by honesty, and led by men whose hearts swelled only for the joy of Allah. Following the death of the prophets, leadership of the Muslim Ummah was transferred to his best friend Abu Bakr al-Siddiq. The whole Arabian Peninsula was in disarray. Apostasy movements had emerged, false prophets had emerged, and tribal allegiances were on the verge of rupturing the harmony that Islam had created. But Abu Bakr was steadfast. With steel-like devotion, he stamped out the rebellions, reinstated the power of Islam throughout Arabia, and restored the light of unity to a land that was suffocating in chaos. Having subdued the internal threats, Abu Bakr looked beyond the borders. He did not look for land or thrones. He saw the responsibility of dawah, the invitation to disseminate the word of Allah to the nations still drowning in oppression and ignorance. Persia was not longer the invincible monster that it used to be. Its military power was weakened, its people were tired, and its government was shaky. Abu Bakr felt that the moment had arrived. The Prophet's words regarding the fall of Persia were still new in the hearts of believers, and thus Abu Bakr took a step that would go down in history. He called upon the sword of Allah. Khalid ibn al-Walidahu was the man who had never faced, defeat whose bravery made even old generals quake. Khalid was sent towards the Persian border, not with conceit, but with a purpose to fling open the doors of truth to a nation long lost in the darkness of fire worship and kingly pride. As Khalid rode with mobile small units into the fringes of Persia, the contrast was vivid. Before them stood humble soldiers clad in plain clothes, rich only in their hearts, but rich in faith. Opposing them were Persian strongholds overflowing. With gold, armies equipped with elephants and complicated weaponry, and soldiers schooled in the best of warfare. Still, wherever the Muslims tread, success was theirs. Not due to numbers or arms, but because their cause was righteous, their hearts honest, and the hidden aid of Allah was with them. Cities fell, Persian garrisons were captured. The people were watching something they had never seen before. An army that fought by day and cried in prayer by night. An army that was not proud of booty, but wept for the souls they were attempting to rescue. This was only the start. The Muslims, still severely outnumbered, started chipping away at the Persian realms in Iraq. Towns previously considered impenetrable were now seeing the banners of Islam aloft above their gates. But the Muslims did not impose Islam on anybody. They presented the same invitation that had been present to Khusro by the Prophet. Accept Islam and be in peace, or keep your religion and pay the jizya as protection in the Islamic State. It was an appeal of justice and mercy, a clear contrast to the oppression many Persians had experienced under the decayed Sassanid regime. Meanwhile, in Medina, with victories mounting and the call of Islam reaching fresh ears, Abu Bakr Radiu was nearing the end of his days. But he had set in motion the machinery for what was to follow. At his death, command devolved on Umar ibn al-Khattab, brother Lahan, a man of great stature, unmatchable vision, and an iron will. Where Abu Bakr had set the foundations, Umar would construct the citadel. Under his leadership, the incursion into Persia became not an expedition, but a revolution. Not a war of conquest, but a war of righteousness. A holy crusade to fulfill the prophecy which had started with a rent epistle. And thus, under the order of Umar and the guidance of wise generals such as Sardin Abi Waqasan, the Muslims were willing to confront the power of what remained of the Persian Empire. The world was in awe. Could a people so simple, so newly united, actually defy a civilization that had dominated for centuries? But history once more was to behold that figures were nothing when hearts were knit together through the truth and when destiny was at the behest of Allah. Persia, the empire that had laughed away Islam, was about to behold the prowess of a faith which was not afraid. And the promise once spoken in the desert heat was now rumbling over empire's gateways. The sun shone hot over the grasslands of Qadisa, a previously peaceful stretch of grass in what is now modern-day Iraq, that would soon be transformed into one of the greatest battlefields in human history. Opposing them were the remnants of the great Sassanid Empire, an empire wounded but not yet defeated, its armies immense and its generals battle-hardened in the science of war. They arrived not only with swords and spears, but with war elephants for destruction, their tusks honed to sharpness and their backs topped with archers. Their generals had gold and silk robes on, tokens of ages of imperial superiority. Amongst them was Rustam Farukadog, the empire's most honored commander, a man renowned for both his military genius and his arrogance. He was Persia's last hope, a bulwark between survival and utter destruction. Opposing them was an army by worldly standards ragged. Muslims under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, a warrior chosen by the Caliph Umari and a close friend of the Prophet Muhammad. Sa'd, who was ill at the moment, fought from a rooftop, commanding with strategy, prayer, and stern faith. His troops did not possess any elephants, huge forts, or dazzling booty. What they possessed was even stronger, the conviction they were bringing the light of truth. Each and every soldier understood they were not fighting for territory or gold. They were fighting to bring the same message the Prophet had sent once in a letter that had been ripped asunder, but whose words still marched, sword in one hand and Quran in the other. The 4-day fight at Qadisa was a grueling one. The elephants shook the ground beneath them. The heavens grew dark with arrow whizzing through the air and war cries echoing across it. The Persians fought like an empire threatened in its very heart. But the Muslims resisted with an army fanned out of prayer, fasting, and the nighttime tears that had washed away their sins. When the elephants first charged, the Muslim lines were shaken, but they recovered quickly, striking at the eyes of the animals, spreading terror into the enemy's greatest asset. It was not raw muscle that turned the day. It was courage tempered with conviction. At the last day, a sandstorm swept across the field, blindfolding both sides. But the Muslims kept moving. Amidst the turmoil, a turning point was reached. Rustam, the great Persian commander, was killed and fell. The forces, of Sasand, watching their leader fall, tumbled into disarray, and fled in panic. Qadisa had fallen, and with it went the pillar of Persian military strength. The Muslims had attained the impossible. The flag of Tawhid now waved where previously the symbols of fire-worshipping kings had waved. It was not simply a triumph of armies, it was a triumph of prophecy. The conquest of Persia, unimaginable in the past, was turning into a lived experience. The same empire that had ripped the letter of Rasul Allah was being ripped apart, battle by battle, city by city, soul by soul. But the Muslims didn't halt at Qadisiyah. The next great target awaited, Mardin, the capital of the Persian Empire. It was no ordinary city. It was the capital of Khusro Parvez, the emblem of Persian dominance. It was under that famous arch of Taki Kisra stood, whose enormous structure spanned the horizon like a diadem over the city. Underneath that arch, once Khusro had sat in haughtiness, deriding the word of Islam. Now his throne was vacant, his successors either killed or dispersed, and Mardin's doors shaking under believers' march. Tsar Nabiwakas Ryu and his troops were coming near when the Persians burnt the bridges over the Tigris River, hoping to impede their movement. But the Muslims remained unwavering and crossed the river on improvised rafts and even swimming through armor and all with horses alongside. This crossing was the stuff of legend. Soldiers later explained that it seemed as if angels were shoving them into the water. When they crossed, they found a city left deserted in fear. The Persian royal family had fled. The soldiers who remained behind surrendered or were nowhere to be seen. Madame, the gem of the Sassanid crown, had fallen without a fight. It was a time bathed in divine imagery. The same city where the letter of the prophet had been ripped to shreds, now in the hands of the men and women who had lived according to every line of that command. And what the Muslims discovered inside left them speechless. Walls studded with gold, halls draped with silk, diamond and emerald-encrusted thrones, riches that whole civilizations would covet. Among the most impressive was the mythical Takus, the peacock throne, a vast throne of kings covered in innumerable gems, a throne that once stood for the immovable pride of Persia. There was also a robe made solely of gold thread, so valuable that it was said to be without price. And still, the Muslim soldiers cried, not from greed or wonder, but from gratitude and awe. Gratitude that Allah had come true on his vow and fear that this wealth could try them harder than the war ever had. When these treasures arrived in Medina, camel caravans were necessary to haul the massive amounts of gold, silver, and jewels. Caliph Omar Khattar, brother, stood quietly as the riches were showered in front of him. Tears dripped down his cheek. He lifted his hands and recited, "O Allah, you tried the former people who preceded us with this, and they failed. I implore you to keep us safe from it." He did not take a single coin for himself. He did not give it to his family. All the pieces were given to Bait Alm, which is the public wealth of the Muslims. This was not a conquest. It was a purification. A land that had previously been founded on arrogance, idolatry, and tyranny was now being cleansed by justice, humility, and light. And yet, even as the capital was taken, the Muslims did not oppress. They did not enslave. They did not destroy homes or burn temples. They permitted the Persians to hold on to their culture, to practice their religion with protection, and even to prosper provided that they were living under the flag of justice. The same enemies whom they had battled yesterday were now neighbors. The booty which they had won was now given back to the poor, the orphan, and the widow. The throne was fallen, the palace bereft, the fire temple hushed. The note had been ripped, yet its message had endured. And now it rested upon the same seat that had been occupied by those who had laughed it off. The prophecy of Muhammad was no longer merely something hoped for. It was something seen, something felt, something irrefutable. And the world looking on from east and west started to realize that this was no common emergence. This was the working out of divine fate. Even when Ma'dan fell and its unimaginable riches were captured, the last curtain had still not fallen on the once great Persian Empire. A wounded animal might be on its deathbed, but its tail still lashes out. Yazdar III, the last of the Sassanid dynasty of emperors, fled in desperation from city to city. From Ma'dan, he fled to Hulwan, thence to Hamadan, thence to Nishapur, and finally Balkh. But wherever he ran, the shadow of prophecy followed him. In every city he arrived at, he discovered panic, collapse, and terror. His trusted troops diminished. His supporters deserted him. His royal robes now felt heavier than his soul, for they reminded him not of greatness, but of a throne lost years ago. The man who had once been a living embodiment of imperial glory now traveled through his own empire like a fugitive, no longer a king, but a reminder of a past that was without a future. Meanwhile, the Muslim armies, unshakable and disciplined, did not pursue for revenge or conquest, but in order to secure that oppression would never again rise in that land. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas Radiu had already found justice and peace at the very center of the empire, and others, such as Numan ibn Muqarrin Radiwanu and Abdullah ibn Amir Radi Alahwanu, were pushing on towards the last cities to resist Yazdur's crumbling authority. Battle after battle, fort after fort, the over 400-year-old empire was disintegrating. Not through fire or flood, but because Allah's will was unfolding in the open. And the moment of reckoning finally arrived. Yazdur, now deserted by even his most loyal commanders, fled to the mill of a poor man. The man who once wore robes of silk, who sipped from goblets of emerald and commanded whole armies, was now begging for safety in the corner of a flour mill. And in that last moment of desperation, he died at the hands of a common man. No army, no throne, no state funeral, no royal procession. The last Persian emperor died in solitude, without a name and remembered by none of his own. It was finished. The prophecy which had started with the shredded letter had come full circle. The empire that scoffed at the messenger had been reduced to shambles by the word of the sender. But here is the miracle the world wasn't expecting. Islam didn't conquer Persia, it changed it. The same earth that had once deified fire, that had once anointed kings with divine hubris, was now a hub of Islamic learning, wisdom, and culture. The same earth that had carried emperors now gave birth to scholars, saints, and seekers of sacred learning. Persia, rather than oppose, accepted the truth with a profundity and earnestness that would shock. Out of its valleys came some of the most brilliant names in Islamic intellectual history. Imam Bukhari, Imam Muslim, Imam Tamdi, Imam Nasa'i, Hadith giants, all Persian in origin. The fire temples collapsed, and in their stead stood madrasas. The poets of courtly patronage were replaced by the poets of mystical love. Men like Rumi, Haris, and Sardi, who married Persian eloquence with Quranic light. And men and women who hitherto bowed to emperors now bowed only to Allah. This was not the death of Persia. It was its rebirth, a rebirth that provided the Ummah, centuries of service, oceans of knowledge and legacies that still define the Muslim world today. Persia was transformed not into a land that was conquered, but a beacon of Islam. And one of the very first indications of this change was a man whose life the Prophet had once acclaimed, Salman al-Farsi Alawa. He was born in the center of Persia, brought up among fire worshippers, but compelled by an appetite for truth so fierce that he left behind everything. His quest took him from the Zoroastrian temples to the monasteries of Christianity, and ultimately to the holy city of Medina, where he encountered the messenger himself. The Prophet did not make him feel like a stranger. He hugged him, respected him, and said, "Salman is from my al-Bate, my family." In Salman's story, we are reminded that truth has no color, no geography, no origin. It is connected only to the heart that looks for it. And as centuries went by, the prophecy of the prophet turned into not only a historical fact, it turned into a living witness. Now, when we stroll through the cities of contemporary Iran, when we turn the pages of Hadith collected by Persian scholars, when we hear the echoes of Islamic civilization on its language and literature, we can witness with our own eyes the realization of that divine promise. Persia did not disappear. It was not defeated. It was raised, not through worldly might, but through divine guidance. And that is the greatest wonder of all, that an empire founded on pride collapsed, and in its stead emerged a people of submission, knowledge, and sincerity. Let us remember the tale of Persia to recall that no throne can be too powerful to topple, no king too powerful to be brought low, and no people too distant to be led. Let it remind us that when the prophet spoke, he did not speak out of desire. It was revelation, truth from beyond the heavens. And every word that he spoke, whether about dynasties or individuals, whether about empires or deserts, has and will continue to be fulfilled. This is not history. This is a sign that Islam isn't founded on myths, but miracles carved in the pages of time, a sign that we belong to a living Ummah, one that has seen the rise and fall of kings and yet still raises the flag of truth high. And most importantly, a sign that the words of our beloved prophet are not to be only read. They must be believed, embraced, and lived.